Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paula Price. I'm with the People's Law School, and I'm the host of today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about home renovations in British Columbia, and we have an amazing speaker joining us today. Her name is Natalie Baker. She's with Aford Partners, LLP. She's a lawyer, and she specializes in municipal law, or her practice largely focuses on municipal law, and we will be introducing her in just in a few short minutes. Before we do that, we would just like to acknowledge that the land on which the People's Team is gathered is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, made up of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And as we make our land acknowledgements, we would invite you to take a moment and reflect on the land that you're joining us from today. We'd also like to acknowledge the funders who have made the production of today's webinar possible. Those are the Law Foundation of British Columbia, the Notary Foundation of British Columbia, and the Department of Justice Canada. And last but not least, we would like to acknowledge our guest speaker, Natalie Baker. And Natalie is a litigator. She practices primarily in the area of municipal law. And just a couple of notes about Natalie. I've actually known Natalie for years, and she kind of many years ago, and she came back into my life a few years ago when some family friends were having some issues with some renovations that they had done on their home, and they sought out our suggestions for lawyers who would know what to do in this situation. I didn't know any personally, and so I asked some of my lawyer colleague friends, and the recommendation that we got back was definitely reach out to Natalie. She's amazing. So we are so thrilled to have Natalie here today. And another fun fact about Natalie is she is the first speaker that we've had on our webinar who was sought out by the press in advance of the webinar to talk about today's topic. So on Friday, Natalie did an interview with, her name is, Jill Bennett. There's the Jill Bennett Show on CKNW. And so Natalie was interviewed about the webinar that she's doing today. So we're super excited. Natalie, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Fabulous. And for any of you who are interested in listening to Natalie's interview, we'll drop a link to that in the chat for you as well. And she starts talking at about minute 34. And there is a reference to an earlier webinar, and that's a webinar that we put on a couple of weeks ago about buying a home in BC. So if buying a home is something that you're interested in, you can find a link to that webinar on the firm or on our website. So with that, Natalie, we're going to jump into our questions today. And the first question that we have is, when you are thinking about doing home renovations, what are 3 things that you should watch out for when it comes to your legal rights and pitfalls that you want to avoid?
Well, the first one I would mention, I think, ties in nicely with the webinar that you did a couple of weeks ago, and it relates to just the first step when you're buying a home. The thing you want to be aware of, you want to find out is whether there's been any unauthorized construction or there's any unauthorized uses going on in the property. And we'll touch on this a little bit later when we deal with one of the other questions, but it's that even if you buy a home that has an illegal suite or there's been work done without permits, the fact that you didn't do the work isn't going to help you down the road if the city ultimately decides to enforce against you. And so to make wise decisions when you're purchasing, if you're buying a house because it's got a mortgage helper, but that mortgage helper is unauthorized, to really think about, okay, if this thing is good, if this house, if they're going to enforce and I've got to shut this down, could I still afford my house or would I have to sell it? So I think the first thing to really know is when you're buying, make sure that you understand that what you're purchasing, if there's a problem with it, that you might ultimately have to change it. So that would be the first thing. And the second thing is, so you bought your home now and you're thinking you want to perhaps put a suite in, or you want to do a renovation, you want to build a new deck. You want to find out what's allowed, obviously, the first thing. And so you want to find out what the rules and regulations are. You want to find out how high can I build my house? How deep can I build my deck? So really the first step is to make sure it's what you want to do is allowed. And that's for two reasons. Obviously, if it's not allowed, you're not going to get your permit. But also, I mean, and I would never recommend this. I mean, people do sometimes do their work without permits. You want to know that if you choose to do a renovation without getting a permit, that whatever you built is at least something that you can get approved should the city ultimately enforce against you. So you want to know that what you're building is what's allowed and can you do it. And then the second and the third thing is, again, it's get a permit. My advice is that you should always follow the rules. I know it's probably tempting sometimes, hoping that you can avoid that cost and the time that can come depending on where you live. That process can be lengthy. But I think you could save yourself a lot of heartache and headache down the road by doing things properly and getting your permits before you start doing any work. So those would be the three points I would make on that question.
Those are excellent points. Thank you, Natalie. I especially like this idea of doing that examination stage when you are buying the home. As you pointed out, mortgage helpers are sometimes something very important to the person who is taking over. And you hear of stories where that was an unauthorized suite. I heard one recently about that happening where the buyer was told that it was an authorized suite. So just knowing that ahead of time, that you want to do your due diligence at the outset. So those are really helpful suggestions. Thank you. This leads us to our next question, which is, what are the most common problems that you see coming up in your practice?
So piggybacking on that last answer, there's two things. One is somebody has bought a house. An unauthorized street is one of probably the most dramatic, because if you can't legalize it and you're relying on the rent that you're getting from it, there's a couple problems. One is if you have to take it out, you might not be able to afford your home, but also the cost of actually bringing it into compliance can be really expensive. So really wanting to make sure that what you're buying, if the city was to tell you you had to change something, could you still afford to, could you do it? So people often come to me for that very reason. There's been some sort of unauthorized suite, and for whatever reason, the city has something they're on their city's radar, and then they've said, okay, well, you either have to take it out or you have to bring it into compliance. And sometimes the result of that is there's a decision, well, I have to sell my home because I can't live without the rent, and I can't afford the cost of doing what I need to do to bring it up to standards. And then the other second most common problem is I've done work without permits. And usually this comes about because a neighbor has noticed that you're now doing a big renovation. And so the city inspects, they determine that you have in fact started doing work on your home without the required permits. And then you're faced with, okay, well, what do I do now? And then it becomes a question of, can I get a permit? Do I need a variance? Do I have to? And then depending on what you've done, it's a question of whether you can legalize the unauthorized work after the fact, or whether you're actually going to have to remove it. And take it down. But those are the two common problems. You've bought something with unauthorized work, or you've done the unauthorized work yourself.
That's very helpful. And Natalie, we didn't talk about this before today's webinar, but when it comes to buying a new home, for example, and there is a suite that's being rented out, I mean, is there a way of checking? Is there an easy way of knowing whether or not that work has been permitted?
Yeah, the city, you can go to the city and usually find out, you can get find out from the city what's approved. And that will give you a pretty good idea of whether, and the other thing actually, in addition to going to the city, is you want to check your property disclosure statement, because the seller will have to disclose to you whether there's any unlawful construction or use.
Excellent, that's very helpful. Things to look out for at the early stages. That brings us to our next question, Natalie, which follows on the last one. And we've just talked about one of those, how to avoid those problems. So what would you recommend doing to avoid the problems we just talked about?
I think the first step, most municipalities have really helpful websites. And you don't necessarily have to dig in through the complicated bylaws. Often just a quick search, do I need a permit, will give you a pretty good summary of when you need a permit and when you don't. For example, if you go onto the City of Vancouver's website, it'll tell you you don't need a permit for this, you likely need a permit for that. And so there's a ton of information directly on on most municipalities' websites. If you're still not clear, you can also usually contact the building department and just ask them directly, or you hire a reputable contractor. They should know the rules about it as well. So I think a great way to avoid it is just to ask those questions in advance. If you're still unsure, and sometimes it isn't that clear, I mean, you can also consult a lawyer. I mean, staff don't always get it right. And so if you want to confirm it, you could consult with a lawyer to see if you need a permit in advance. And then again, to avoid the problem, if you need the permit, you apply for it. That's the best way to avoid most of those problems. So find out whether you need one. Again, looking at the city's information, and then apply for it if you do.
Excellent, thank you. And Natalie, as we were preparing for today, you mentioned that your practice is mainly in Vancouver, and that the rules are a bit different depending on the municipality. So you'll want to be, for someone like me who doesn't do this on a regular basis, it's interesting to know where to go. So for anybody who's out there looking to do the home renovations, they're going to have their own specific rules that apply in their municipality, and they may not be the same as the rules in another. I think that's what we had talked about.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the rules aren't the same across the province. So it's really important to check the rules for your particular, where your home is. Some have stricter rules than others. For some municipalities, like in Vancouver, almost everything requires a permit. There are other municipalities where you can build a small shed without a permit. You can do other things I mean, everything has to be to code. You always have to comply with the BC building code, but you don't necessarily need a permit for the work. So you always want to check with the rules in your local municipality.
Super. Thank you, Natalie. So if you are in a situation where the work that you want to do requires a permit, how does the permitting process work?
Well, in Vancouver, it's a little bit more complicated. I'm going to sort of just highlight that there's a preliminary step that you might have to go through, which is a development permit stage. You might need what's called a development permit before you can even apply for your building permit. And that can be a fairly labor-intensive, time-consuming process, depending on your project. I think I'll just going to touch on that, and then just wanted to highlight that's something that you might have to do before you even go to your building permit. Once you've gotten past that stage, then the permit process after that, again, that can really depend on the municipality as well. For some, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to hand in your sketch, so a smaller municipality, and you might have a survey and you get your building permit. Again, as long as everything's built to code, that's all there is to it. In other municipalities like Vancouver, it is a lot more complicated, and all you have to do, if you just search Vancouver renovation building permit checklist, and you'll see a really lengthy checklist, surveys, floor plans, site plans, a whole zoning assessment. And so you'll have to look again at each municipality to determine how, what exactly you're going to need to submit as part of your building permit application. So, I mean, do you need a DP? And then you're okay, is it allowed? If it is allowed, then it's what do I need to submit? You're likely going to have drawings, likely going to have surveys, and then you submit those. Once it's approved, you get your building permit. Then you have to look at whether you need trades permits separately from that, plumbing, electrical, those sorts of things. And then once you have your permit in hand, then you can start construction.
Excellent. And Natalie, I mean, it sounds like a multi-step process, to say the least. Is this something that homeowners tend to do on their own? Do they typically get a contractor to do this? Is there somebody who you see who's often doing this?
I think it depends on the scale of the project. I mean, I don't have an answer that applies to right across the board. I mean, some people decide they'd rather have a contractor manage the project, and I think that does depend on. Are you planning to just build a new deck, or are you planning to do, take off the first floor of your house and rebuild that story? So I think it depends on the scale of the project and whether you'd want to have a contractor or not, whether the person gets one. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. And what happens if you go ahead and you do work and it's not permitted work? Then what happens?
So there's a few things that can happen, and there's so let's say a city inspector has come to your property. They've determined that you've done something without a permit. What usually happens from there is you'll get a letter saying, we've determined that you've done unauthorized work. You're either going to have to remove the unauthorized construction and restore it to the approved permits, or you're going to have to apply for permits to bring it into compliance. Now, the road that you choose there, which path you choose is kind of going to depend on whether or not you can bring it into compliance or not. If something is totally unlawful, you might have to remove it. If it's permittable, then you can apply for your permits and ultimately get it approved. Although that doesn't mean you might not get charged with a bylaw offense down the road or get fined, but you can still at least get it approved. Now, there's sort of a hybrid in there as well, where let's take the example of a deck. So you built a deck, you tore down your old deck, you built a new one, and you built it much larger. And so it now encroaches into what is required to be your backyard. So there's setbacks, for example. You have to have a minimum setback, and you've now built your deck into the required setback. Part of it getting approved, so it technically, it doesn't comply with the rules, but it doesn't mean that you can't get it ultimately approved. For example, there's options of applying to the Board of Variance. So you submit an appeal to the Board of Variance, and you try to get the regulations in the bylaw relaxed. So you try to get that setback relaxed. And if that's approved, then you can still apply for your permits and get it legalized. So there's ways after the fact of ultimately getting these things approved. If you lose at the Board of Variance, though, for example, then what you might have to do is tear it down and build one that complies. Again, the other thing of if you're caught building without a permit is that you can also get fined. There can be bylaw prosecutions. So even if you ultimately do find a way to get it legalized, that won't stop the city from potentially charging with a bylaw offense.
Interesting. And do you have a period of time before the penalties or the prosecution would happen? Like, what's the time frame?
There's no particular time frame. I mean, I find that looking at Vancouver as an example, if you get that letter saying bring it into compliance or apply for your permit, I mean, once you're working on that permit and trying to work with the city to fix it, they might not even choose to go ahead with the bylaw prosecution. So they're not necessarily tied to one another, that you're immediately going to be charged with a bylaw offense while you're receiving this letter. So I've found situations where as long as you're, especially when you didn't do the work, when you bought a house with a problem and you're trying to fix it, you're not necessarily going to find yourself being fined or charged for that, as long as you're working to try to fix it.
Fabulous. And that brings us to our next question. And you mentioned, Natalie, that you may need to go to the Board of Variance. So what exactly is the Board of Variance? And is that a process where you would need a lawyer, or is that something that you could do on your own?
So the Board of Variance is from Vancouver, has 5 board members. It's an independent board. They're appointed by members of council. And what they do is they consider variances to the bylaw. So where the bylaw is potentially going to be strictly enforced, if the strict enforcement of the bylaw creates a hardship. A great example is say you bought a lot, it's got an irregular shape, and so you can't really build the house you would normally be entitled to build. You might go to the Board of Variance and apply for a relaxation of certain provisions so that you can build the house that is different than what's actually allowed under the zoning bylaw. And so they're generally there to relieve against hardship. It's a really informal procedure. A very practical way of getting some of these things resolved. Again, let's say you bought that house that has the deck that is a little bit too big, and the city has now said, well, you're going to have to bring it into compliance. Well, you can go to the Board of Variance. You ask for the setback to be reduced, and if you're approved, then the whole thing becomes assuming everything else complies, it's approvable. So so it's actually a great way of dealing with some of the strict where the bylaws can be kind of harsh depending on something about the property. It's a great way of getting those things resolved. You do not need a lawyer. I mean, there might be times where you do want to have a lawyer, and that's more where if it's a particularly complicated matter, or there's a question of, does the Board of Variance have the authority to make a decision on the variance? Then there are times where it might be useful to have a lawyer present, but for the most part, you won't need a lawyer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. Are there any ways other than are there any other ways that you can get a variance?
Yeah, there's another way you can do it. In all other municipalities, you can also get what's called a development variance permit. And so for that, you have to apply to City Council. And then they can vary any provision of the bylaw as well. Although I should say this with respect to the Board of Variance and for a development variance permit, neither the Board of Variance nor Council can actually vary use or density. So they can't allow it to be bigger, and they can't allow a use that's not allowed in the bylaw. But so you can go to council and also get variances. And you can do both ways. So you could get refused at the Board of Variance, and you could go to City Council, or you get refused by City Council, and then you could try your chances with the Board of Variance. So those are 2 different ways of potentially getting a variance. The thing about going through a development variance permit route by a council permit is that they're not as the Board of Variance is more hardship, whereas council has a lot more flexibility on granting development variance permits.
Fabulous. And Natalie, you mentioned there were a couple of things that could not be varied. I think it was size and density.
Use and density.
Sorry, use and density. So what are some of the common allowable variances that you might see?
Height, setback. Setback is a big one. Siting, those types of regulations like that.
And for those of us not in the know, what is a setback and a siting?
So the siting, well, they're kind of related. A siting where it sits on the property setback can be the same thing. So for example, you might have a rule that says your front yard setback, it must be a minimum of 10 meters, whatever it is. And so that creates how far back you have to actually start the construction. So you have a space there. Same with a rear yard setback. You're going to also have side yard setbacks. The space between the adjacent property line, where you can build your house with respect to that property line. So it's all about sort of where your property, where the building is going to sit on the property.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So for the next question is, under what circumstances is a building inspector allowed to enter your home?
So the building inspectors can inspect your property and go onto your property to inspect for the purposes of ensuring that you're complying with the bylaws. And so they are allowed to, I know that seems surprising to people, but they are allowed to come in and inspect. Now, with respect to entering your home, they have to either get your consent or provide notice. And so what you'll often find is that you'll get a letter saying, we've received a complaint, we'd like to come and inspect. They'll set a time, and then they'll give you an opportunity to say if that's convenient or not, and then you could try to set a different time. But that's how they generally do it, is that it's got to be a reasonable notice or consent, but they can in fact attend to inspect your home. I mean, they can't show up on your property at 3 a.m. It has to be also, they can go onto your property, it has to be in a reasonable time, in a reasonable manner. So probably would be very reasonable to start lurking around your property at 3 in the morning, but they can come on to inspect the property. And then there's it's a little stricter when it comes to actually inspecting within the home, because they have to get consent or notice or provide notice.
Interesting. Thank you, Natalie. And you mentioned that they might receive notice of a complaint. So what does that look like? How do these issues become known to authorities who would come in to inspect in the first place?
Well, most of these, when these things come up, where the city has raised an unauthorized construction, it's almost always complaint driven. So it's not that there are city inspectors, circling around, driving the city looking for people who are doing work without constructions. It's generally because a neighbor has seen you doing work, and that's what's triggered they get a complaint, and then they investigate, and that's what will trigger the inspector wanting to come and have a look to see if there's unauthorized construction. So, but it is a complaint driven process.
Excellent. And so it's really the neighbors. And so and I think you had mentioned that also in the interview that you did with Jill Bennett. And we have some resources on the website, the People's Law School website, about how to deal with your relationships with your neighbors where there's a potential dispute. And so anybody who is in that position where you may have an issue with your neighbor, we would recommend looking at those pages on our website, and we'll put those in the chat for anybody who's interested.
I kind of joked about it, but it said, what's the best piece of advice? I say, get along with your neighbors. I mean, it's true. Obviously you want to get your permits, but getting along with your neighbors is a really important part in all this as well, because every little thing that you do, if you're not getting along with your neighbors, they're watching you, and you'll find that they can there's a lot of complaints being made to inspectors because of just relations that have kind of fallen apart between neighbors.
I bet. Absolutely. Absolutely. The pages that we have on neighbor relationships and fences and sounds and smells and all that, those are some of the most popular pages that we have. I think it's especially in the past year and a half, where neighbors have been living, spending more time at home, spending more time with each other. So our next question is, so if an inspector has a notice, they issue a notice, for example, or they have your consent, they're going in because they've received a complaint about one thing, let's say it's the deck. when they go in, are they allowed to look for other issues, other bylaw infractions?
Yeah, I mean, they're allowed to inspect to ensure that the bylaws are being complied with. So if they notice some unauthorized work and they want to make sure that there's no other unauthorized work, the inspectors can certainly inspect to determine that whether or not there are other bylaw compliance issues. And I just emphasize bylaw compliance because that's what they have the power to inspect for. So, you know, if you have a bylaw inspector who doesn't need to get a warrant show up, but they show up with the police or the RCMP, I mean, that's where you'd want to be a lot more careful and probably say no and to, you know, require a warrant. But they are allowed to investigate for the purpose of ensuring bylaw compliance. Excellent.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. And we touched on this a bit earlier, but if can a homeowner be forced to correct unpermitted work that was done 20, 30 years ago?
They can. Yeah, and I think people are surprised to hear that. And it comes up a lot. It does come up in Vancouver. You have a lot of older homes. And so work that was done years ago, I used the example of an unauthorized suite. And so, yeah, even if they bought it and it's been like that for years, but the permits don't show that work, then the city can, if they want to, they can require the property to be brought up into compliance. Yeah.
Interesting. It's amazing to think that there would have that reach, especially if it's an older home with the construction dating back, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, there might be potential arguments there. And so one of the things you want to look at was, for example, this is a great opportunity to just touch on this. I mean, sometimes you have what's called a lawfully non-compliant building. So it might not meet today's standards, but when it was approved 50 years ago, it was allowed. And so you do get to maintain, you get to continue that use or have those regulations maintained, even though it doesn't comply with today's standard. You'd have a lawfully non-conforming building if you can establish that it's always been this way, and you know it was approved way back when. Then you wouldn't be required to bring that into compliance. You could maintain it the way it is.
Excellent, excellent. And Natalie, this is our last question before returning to the live questions. And the question here is, how can you avoid problems with contractors you hire? And the thinking here is contractors that may not be well-versed in the permitting process. What would you recommend?
I would ask around probably to make sure you're getting the right contractor. You want to find a reputable contractor. So that would be my first piece of advice, is just to make sure you pick the right one. And that's maybe asking around to make sure that you're getting somebody that's reputable. I would be kind of weary of a contractor that says, you know, don't worry about your permits. That's probably a little bit of a red flag there. So, you know, if your contractor is saying, you know, if they're acknowledging you need the permits and telling you don't worry about it, I think that's something you probably want to avoid.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Natalie, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and start looking at the live Q&A. And as we do that, the question that I imagine is on the mind of many people is how much it costs to get a permit.
Again, municipality, it varies from municipality to municipality, and it depends also, the amount depends, but also how they calculate the amount also depends. So most municipalities will have a development fees bylaw, and so for some, I was just looking yesterday to give a sense. I was looking at District of West Vancouver, and so some of them, it's on a scale of, it depends on the value of the work. So as the value goes up, the amount of the fee goes up. And so I think it was like the first 1,000 was $80, and then it kind of goes up in 100,000, 200,000, and then up to $1 million was something like 6,000, but then everything over $1 million was about 13,000. So sometimes it's the value of the work, sometimes it's based on that and a combination with the size of the project, the square footage. I think Vancouver has kind of partially a square footage model. I think the building permit is less than the development permit in Vancouver. I'm not sure about that, but I think it's also I think the building permit is similar to other municipalities, but yeah, it's usually based on the value of the construction that the value of the work that you're proposing to do. But it does fluctuate. It changes from municipality to municipality. So again, you'll have to check the rules there.
Thank you for that. So Natalie, for the live questions, I'm going to start with this first question. It has 5 upvotes. So I'll read it to you. If a house flipper or anybody does extensive renovations without a permit, and this latent defect is discovered, this known latent defect can create problems with insurability and eligibility for a mortgage. What disclosure documents or steps can protect a home buyer from an unscrupulous house flipper?
Well, there's a couple things you can do. I mean, first of all, you're going to have your property disclosure statement, which is supposed to tell you that if there's unauthorized work, they're supposed to disclose it. But the other thing you can do is just your own due diligence. If you are concerned that there's been some major renovation that might not be permitted, you can go to the city and find out whether what's there is allowed. So, I mean, there's also, I mean, you should be able to rely on the property disclosure statement, but if you're still not convinced, it would be to go to the city and get further information.
Fabulous. Thank you, Natalie. This next question has three upvotes, and this is what I imagine you may see quite a bit. Can I build a shed on my property without a permit in the city of Vancouver?
The city of Vancouver, I'm not sure. There are municipalities that exempt sheds that are, say, under 100 square feet. You won't need a building permit for that. I've certainly seen that in bylaws where that's an exemption. I'm not sure about the city of Vancouver, but that's something that should be able to find out fairly quickly by, again, just going to the city's website. My initial reaction is probably yes, that you'll need a permit, because almost all construction in Vancouver needs a permit, but without looking at that specific question about do I need a permit for a shed in Vancouver, I don't know the answer to it.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think it goes back to one of our earlier discussions previously is doing that, taking that step of going and seeing what the requirements are, because they will be different depending on the municipality, but it should be available. And I think you mentioned calling into the building inspector's office and the building department.
Yeah, if you don't get enough information from looking at the city's website, or you're still unclear, you could just call the building department, and they should probably have a pretty quick answer to that as well.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. So we have a next, our next question is, what remedies does one have to previous renovations done by a previous owner that may not have had a permit?
Well, again, I guess it's going to come down to whether it was disclosed or not. I mean, if it was disclosed and you bought it anyway, I mean, you probably won't have much of a remedy there. You bought it, and that's why I raised that first question at the outset. Know what you're buying, and so if it was disclosed that there was this unauthorized work and you bought it, you probably wouldn't really have any remedy against the buyer. Now, if work was done and they said there was no unauthorized work and it came up, then you might have some sort of you might have a claim against the vendor. But again, if you buy it knowing it, then you probably wouldn't have a remedy against the vendor.
Excellent. So it really is a question of looking at that disclosure statement and seeing what was said about the property. Thank you. Here's another one. I imagine this is one that you may see as well in your practice. My neighbor built a large deck less than 3 feet from our property without a permit. Will the city make him move the portion too close to us, or must we go to a lawyer?
Well, you can go to a lawyer, but I would try the complaint process first. You call bylaw enforcement and you would make a complaint. And then again, that what they would, the likely process there, the way it would likely unfold is the city would inspect. They might tell them you either have to comply, you have to bring it into compliance or remove it. They might have the option of going to the Board of Variance and getting a setback relaxation. From what you're saying, it sounds like they built it too close to your property line. So, at the Board of Variance, you'd have an opportunity generally to speak as well as an affected neighbor. So you'd get notice of that. If they went to the Board of Variance, you get notice of that and you could speak and you try to oppose it. If they don't get the variance, then they'd have to actually remove that part of the deck. They'll have to get permits and remove that part of the deck that isn't permitted. So, but you don't necessarily need a lawyer because it might just resolve itself through the complaint process. Excellent.
Thank you, Natalie. And that would be an example of what we were talking about earlier, is that the city isn't going necessarily looking for these bylaw non-compliant structures or renovations, but if you are aware of one, then you can raise that with and sorry, who would you contact in that case?
Bylaw enforcement generally.
The bylaw enforcement. So when you contact them, then that sets that process in motion.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you for that. Natalie, you're doing a great job. We got lots of questions coming your way. So this next one is, how do I know for sure my neighbor has obtained a proper permit for their new deck or shed?
Contact the city. Yeah, you can. Sometimes you might have to do an FOI request. You could call the planning department. If it's not your property, they might not give up the information too willingly. So, I mean, if it's obvious construction, again, you could call bylaw enforcement. You can try to get the information by, sometimes you can find permits online by calling the building department, but the other way you can eventually get at that is going through the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So you can do what's called an FOI request and request records relating to any approvals for that specific property. I mean, and so that's another way. You will get your information that way. It's just a little bit more time consuming.
Excellent. So are all these permits then a matter of public record, and meaning that, I mean, you're talking about this freedom of information process that you may need to go through, but would the permits relating to homes generally be available to anybody who's interested? I've been able to obtain things like that through FOI request. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, whether there'd be some objection by the property owner that it shouldn't be disclosed, I've never really run into that when I've tried to get permissions for relating to homes or businesses. You can usually get that through the FOI request process.
Excellent. So these are typically public filings, like the way a corporation would have a public record and home ownership would have a public record.
File.
Fabulous. Thank you. So here's another question. This might be running along the themes of some of the earlier questions. What if my neighbor's new shed is built right alongside our shared fence?
Well, there's two issues there. Again, do they need a permit, but also it's that setback issue. It really depends on, I mean, it depends on not only the municipality, it depends on what zone you're in, right? There's different zoning designations all over. For example, the city has Vancouver has all sorts of different zones. Most municipalities do. So it depends on the rules for the particular municipality, but also more specifically for that particular zoning for that property. I mean, what's described there, it sounds like the person who's asked the question is concerned that the shed should not have been built in that location. So you can pretty quickly determine by calling the city, finding out, first of all, your neighbor is likely to have the same zoning as you. And then you can just go and look at the zoning bylaw. You find that zoning, it's actually fairly simple to do it. And then it sets out all the rules and regulations for that particular zone. And that'll give you a good sense of whether something is unauthorized or not.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. That's really, really helpful. And I guess at that point, you could either talk to your neighbor about the shed and ask them to move it if it's possible, or you would need to go and report to the bylaw office to have them deal with it.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Here's another question, Natalie. I feel like you're fielding these like a pro, and you are a pro. So this one is: are permits needed to prune tree branches from a neighbor's tree that overhang onto your property?
Trees is a great question and something to be really careful of, especially in Vancouver. Now, pruning, there's two parts of that question. One is, are you allowed to remove something that's trespassing on your property? And as I understand it, that's right. If you've got branches that are overhanging, you are allowed to take care of the trespass and remove those overhanging branches, but you have to be really careful about the tree cutting bylaw, especially in Vancouver, which is really strict. And again, this is one of those ones where every municipality has different rules about tree cutting. But I think that even pruning a tree, especially if it causes damage to the tree, can be an offense under the tree bylaw. And can carry a really heavy fine. So I would suggest that before you do any work to a tree, either on your property or on that's on a neighbor's property and overhanging onto yours, that you check that bylaw first, because well, there's kind of two things at play. There's that trespass issue, but then there's the separate issue of the tree bylaw, and making sure that you don't run afoul of that.
Excellent. That's super helpful. And I noticed in the chat and in the typed answer to that question, there are some links to resources on the People's Law School website, which deal with neighbor questions. And that question of trees and overhanging branches is in part addressed. I think there's this permitting question as well. But those questions there's information about those questions on the website as well. The next one is: there is a tree close to my house. It belongs to the municipality. The roots and branches encroach on my property and are damaging my lawn and fence. The municipality doesn't remove the tree and doing proper action upon my written request. Is there any way to enforce the municipality to solve the issue, and what procedure should I follow?
Maybe. I mean, there's a few things you could do there. One is, normally you're not allowed to cut down. It used to be that you could cut down one tree a year or something in Vancouver. Now you can't cut down any tree on your property, even on your own property, if it's a certain size. But there's an exemption for that where, now this is a municipal tree, so it's maybe a little bit more complicated, but it would be to see if you can apply for the permit because it's causing damage. One of the exemptions to when you can get a permit for a tree cutting, this is in Vancouver at least, so I'm just going to assume it's Vancouver, although I appreciate it might be a different municipality, is to see if you can get that permit to cut it down because it's causing damage. The other option you could look at is to put the city on notice of a potential claim for damages as a result of the tree damaging your property. And then that might actually trigger the city paying more attention to it and doing something about the tree. And then there's potentially some sort of, you could potentially bring some sort of action if the city's tree is causing a nuisance and damaging your property if it comes to that. But I would probably try to apply for a permit to have it cut down on the grounds that it's a hazardous tree, it's causing damage to property, and go that route first.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm just looking at the time and we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'll see if we have time for maybe a couple more questions. There's one question here, Natalie, that I think might come up quite a bit, which is, do you need a permit for a basic kitchen renovation, i.e. new cabinets, a change the island, build a corner pantry? Is that the sort of thing that would require a permit?
From what you're describing, likely, well, cupboards, flooring, that kind of stuff doesn't require a permit. If you're moving any plumbing around as a result of you putting in an island, things like that, you might need plumbing permits. But those kind of more, again, you'll want to check depending on the municipality, but that kind of stuff typically doesn't require a permit. You can change your cupboards, you can change your flooring, you can do those kind of things. Again, I would just be, if you need to change your plumbing, the location of your plumbing, or putting in new plumbing or electrical, anything like that, then you'd probably need those kind of trades permits, at least at the very least.
Yeah. Excellent. So if you're looking at plumbing, electrical, certain types of walls, I imagine, like if it's the structural wall.
If you're moving, I think people sometimes think that because it's inside their home, they don't need a permit for it, but you still need a permit. If you're changing the configuration of your rooms, moving those structural walls around, you'll need a permit for that kind of work.
Excellent. And this is a question that we haven't really touched on, but the time allowed for something like this, is there a certain time frame in mind that these typically get processed?
How long it takes to get a building permit?
Yeah.
Totally depends. Vancouver can be quite long. Other municipalities are really fast. It really depends on the scope of the project, and it also depends on the municipality. So I wouldn't say there's a typical time period. It's going to vary from municipality to municipality and from project to project.
Excellent. Thank you. There's one last question that we have time for today, Natalie, which is, if I file a complaint of bylaw violation by my neighbor, can I ask the city not to disclose my identity?
Yes, and they're not supposed to disclose your identity. That's protected information under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So you can ask it, but they're also not supposed to disclose it. So if you submit a written complaint, for example, they're supposed to redact any identifying information about you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And actually, Natalie, I'm going to ask you one last question. I'm sorry. You've answered so many questions. You've done such a beautiful job. So, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I'd like to buy and renovate a strata at UBC. So is doing a strata renovation at UBC the same as doing a strata renovation in the city of Vancouver?
UBC is its own, is a separate entity. It's not the city of Vancouver, and the rules there are totally different. And so, yeah, the strata rules are going to be the same, but the bylaws are totally different. And so, no, it's not the same as Vancouver necessarily.
Excellent. So I'm just looking at the questions. And there's one, but it's a very long question. I'm going to read it and see if we can, sorry, I don't, it says the beauty of doing things live. In the situation of a co-op apartment wherein you also need to keep the peace with shareholders that live in the building, what steps are prudent? We had asbestos in our apartment professionally removed. We've had all new wiring pulled and panel put in. We've put in new plumbing, new insulation, and had a short section of weight-bearing support area replaced to meet code, but noted a few things that would not meet current code, e.g. fire suppression system. Given it's within a building built in the mid-1950s, it doesn't meet current code. Would our particular apartment need to meet code, or will we continue to fall outside the current code? We personally funded the cost of some of the corrections, but would like to know if we could approach the co-op board for financial assistance. It's unlikely we would, but there are a few shareholders that are disgruntled about everything done in the building and have already started to throw stones.
I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I'll just say on this question of code, like current building code standards, the building code, unless it's like a hazard issue, doesn't apply retroactively. So there are ways of achieving what's called code compliance. It's all alternative solutions. And so you want to get a code consultant to look at that, because it might not meet current code, but if it met a previous code standards, there's ways of maybe still achieving compliance through alternative solutions without having to do a full upgrade.
Fabulous. Natalie, thank you so much. That was our last live question. So I'm just going to bring up my slides again, and here we go. Put our closing slide up. Natalie, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure having you here. And I think not only are you our first guest to be interviewed by the news before one of our webinars, but that may be the most live questions that we've gone through during a live webinar broadcast. So thank you for answering those questions so thoughtfully and thoroughly. We really appreciate it. Before we sign off today, is there anything you'd like to share with our guests?
I would just urge guests that who are thinking of doing renovations to really look at the rules first, and if a permit is required, to get that permit first. It'll save you a lot of trouble down the road. So I would just finish on that note. Absolutely. And thank you again, Natalie. It's been such a pleasure having you here today. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today from all over BC. It's been a pleasure having you here.